When I crossed the border for the first time, my heart pounded like it was about to burst out of my chest. Out there in the darkness, beyond the tall bushes, lay my dream. The American dream. The land of opportunity, where every job is honest and perseverance is rewarded. Back then I didn't even know what taxes or trespassing meant, I just wanted to live. I wanted Maria to live, for our little girl Sofia, to be born not amidst the dust and heat of a Mexican desert town but in a place where she would have a future. I was young, 24 years old, full of energy and hope. We walked in a group of people just like me. Our guide assured us he knew a safe path. We carried only the essentials: water, canned food, photos of loved ones, all of it fit into a small backpack. I remember one guy, Jorge, lost his shoes to the thorns. He walked barefoot but didn't stop. No one stopped. We knew that if you slowed down you'd either get caught or be left behind. When we finally crossed onto American soil, I saw endless fields for the first time, vast, open spaces that felt surreal after the narrow streets of my hometown. That moment is etched into my memory, the scent of fresh grass, the wind hitting my face, and the thought that from now on, everything would be different. I spent my first night in the home of a Mexican man who had been living here illegally for 5 years. His name was Jose. He gave me a sleeping bag and bread with beans. "Welcome to America, brother," he said with a smile. I smiled back, but deep down a fear began to grow. A fear that I might not make it. That Maria might never join me here. That I might not endure. A few days later I found my first job. Construction. They paid in cash, $200 a week. I worked from dawn to dusk with no days off. In broken English they explained to me, "Your job, carry bricks, cement, trash." I nodded, not understanding half the words but doing everything they told me. After work I would return to Jose's place, collapse onto a mattress and think about Maria. We met when I was 18. She sold fruit at the market and I bought apples from her every day even though no one at home ate them. A year later we got married. She always believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. "You can do it," she said as she saw me off at the bus station headed for a border town. "Just take it step by step." After 6 months of work I was finally able to send her money so she could join me. Those were the longest 6 months of my life. I couldn't sleep at night thinking about how she was managing alone, pregnant, with our debts. When she arrived I felt happiness for the first time in a long time. We rented a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town. It smelled damp and the old cabinets were falling apart, but it was our home. It was there, in that apartment, that Sofia was born. Life got better but not for long. One construction job wasn't enough. While Maria stayed home with Sofia I searched for extra work. In the evenings I cleaned offices and on weekends I mowed lawns in wealthy neighborhoods. I saw how people lived in luxury, their huge homes, shiny cars and swimming pools. But I didn't feel envy. I told myself, they earned it. And I will too. Sometimes I worked 20 hours straight. I ate on the go and slept in my car. Maria scolded me, "You'll kill yourself at this pace?" But I just shrugged. We were undocumented. We had no choice. All we had was faith that one day things would change. The years passed. Sofia started school. She was a bright child, a fast learner. Her favorite word was future. She repeated it over and over, doodling in her notebooks. I looked at her and thought that maybe my sacrifices weren't in vain. That this country might actually give her a chance. But then everything changed. A new president. A new order. The news was full of stories about deportations. I saw police patrols on our streets and watched as our neighbors disappeared. People were too afraid to leave their homes. For the first time in years I felt my dream crumbling. One evening I came home to find Maria in tears, holding a letter. It was a notice. "You must leave the United States within 30 days. My heart sank. How? What? We haven't done anything wrong. But the law doesn't care who you are or what you've done. To them we were just numbers and a statistic. Now, as I look around my home filled with boxes of our belongings, it feels like a nightmare. Sofia sits in the corner hugging her toy dog. Maria is packing up our photos. And I just stand there not knowing what to say. How do I explain to them that our dream is over? That everything we fought for is gone? But I know one thing, we're not done fighting. Tomorrow we'll leave, but that doesn't mean we'll give up. America taught me one thing, there's always a chance. And I will fight for that chance until the very end. Lately, every day began the same, with a feeling of fear that wouldn't let go for a second. Our life had turned into a survival game, and I wasn't even sure if there were any winners. The news spoke of only one thing: inspections, raids, deportations. People disappeared as if they had never existed. Those who had been around yesterday were now on buses taking them back across the border. We had only 30 days to leave on our own, or we'd be thrown out like unwanted trash. The first time the police stopped me was in a supermarket parking lot. I had just finished my shift at the construction site and stopped to buy milk for Sophia. One of the officers, a young guy, looked at my dirty work pants and jacket and asked for my documents. I felt a chill run through me. My hand trembled as I showed him the fake ID I had bought a few years ago. He studied it for a long time, then smirked and said, "Next time take better care of your stuff. These papers look like a dog chewed on them." He handed them back and walked away. But I knew there might not be a next time. When I got home, I found Maria setting the table for dinner. Sophia was already asleep and there were 2 plates of rice and beans on the table. The meal was simple, but Maria always had a way of making it feel special. This time she smiled, but I could tell it was forced. "What happened?" she asked, noticing my state. I sat down and told her about the police. Her eyes filled with worry and a heavy silence settled between us. We knew time wasn't on our side. But what could we do? Where could we run when the whole world was against us? "We have to prepare," Maria said quietly. "If they come for us?" I nodded, but inside I was boiling. I was angry at myself, at this country, at the entire world. I worked 3 jobs, paid rent, saved every penny. We didn't steal or do anything wrong. So why were we treated like enemies? A few days later, the news reported that the police had started using new technology to track undocumented immigrants: drones, facial recognition cameras, even databases where we were all listed. For the first time I felt true fear. Before, I had at least felt like we had a chance to hide, but now it seemed like everything was out of our hands. One evening as I was walking home from work, I noticed more police cars in our neighborhood. They patrolled the streets, stopped by houses, talked to people. I saw one family, our neighbors, trying to argue with the police. Their 2 children, a boy and a girl, were crying as they were put into a car. Maria watched from the window, tears streaming down her face. "This could be us," she whispered when I approached her. I hugged her, trying to comfort her, but my own hands were shaking. Sophia came up to us, clutching her toy dog, and asked, "Papa, why are you sad?" I didn't know how to answer. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that her home is no longer hers? We couldn't wait to be found. I knew that every day we stayed here increased the risk. But leaving felt like admitting defeat. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to give up. Everything we had was built with our hands. I felt like this country belonged to us just as much as it did to those born here. As always, Maria was the one to make the decision. "We have to leave," she said firmly. "For Sophia. For us. We'll start over, but together." Her words made sense, but it was hard to accept. I tried to find reasons to stay, but there were none. We started packing. Everything that didn't fit in the car had to be sold. Our home, the one we loved so much, turned into a pile of boxes and memories. Sophia watched it all with a look of confusion but didn't ask any questions. Her silence said more than any words could. The night before we left, I sat on the porch of our house. The street was quiet, with only the distant sound of dogs barking. Memories flooded my mind. The first time I saw this house, the housewarming party we had, Sophia taking her first steps in the yard. I felt a lump in my throat but tried to hold it together. Maria came out and placed a hand on my shoulder. "We'll be okay," she said. "The important thing is that we're together." I nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that we had lost. I had worked so hard, tried so much, but it was all for nothing. America didn't become the home I had imagined. In the morning we got into the car and drove toward the border. It was the same road I had traveled years ago, full of hope. Now, I drove down it feeling only emptiness. But somewhere deep inside a thought flickered: this isn't the end. The evening was unusually quiet. A cool breeze blew outside, gently stirring the curtains in our tiny living room. Maria and I had finished packing. Boxes lined the walls like sentinels guarding our past. Each one held memories, photographs, Sophia's toys, the kitchenware Maria had carefully collected over the years. I sat at the table with a mug of cheap coffee. Inside, a storm raged: anger, resentment, fear. It was a cocktail of emotions I couldn't control. Maria, as always, tried to stay strong. She methodically folded the remaining items, checked the documents, and reassured Sophia. But I noticed how her hands trembled as she tried to close the suitcase. "Are you sure we've packed everything?" she asked, not looking at me. I nodded, though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. How could you be certain when your life was falling apart right before your eyes? Sophia was already asleep. We had sold her bed to the neighbors, and now she lay on a mattress on the floor, hugging her favorite toy dog. I looked at her and felt my heart breaking. She was too young to understand what was happening. To her, this was just another move. Why can't we stay? She had asked me earlier and I couldn't find the words to answer. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that the country she calls home no longer wants her? Maria came over and placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was light, but I felt all her strength in it. She knew how hard this was for me and supported me as best she could. In moments like these, I realized how lucky I was to have her. She wasn't just my wife, she was my rock, my light in this endless tunnel. We'll get through this, she said. The most important thing is that we're together. I nodded but couldn't say a word. Inside, everything was screaming with pain, but I couldn't let it show. I had to stay strong for them. We triple-checked the documents. Of course, we didn't have passports, just the fake IDs we had bought from a guy a few years ago. I knew they wouldn't hold up to serious scrutiny, but we had no other choice. We loaded everything into our old minivan, which barely started. I was afraid it wouldn't make it to the border, but it was the only vehicle we had. Before leaving, I looked around the house. The walls, which had witnessed our joys and sorrows, now seemed empty and unfamiliar. In the kitchen sat an empty can of beans, left as a farewell gift for the neighbors. The clock on the wall had stopped weeks ago. This house had been ours, but now it was just a building. It was no longer a home. Before we left, we stopped by to say goodbye to our neighbors. Miguel and Lucia, an elderly couple, had always treated us like their own children. Lucia hugged Maria and started crying. "You're strong," she said. "You'll make it." Miguel shook my hand and told me that if we ever came back, we'd always have a place with them. His words warmed me, but they also deepened the pain. We were heading into the unknown, and no one could say what awaited us. By the time we finally drove away, it was dark outside. The road was empty, with only the occasional truck passing by. Sophia slept in the back seat, and Maria sat beside me, silently gazing out the window. The silence in the car wasn't peaceful. It was tense, oppressive, weighing down on us like a heavy blanket. I thought about the first time we drove down this road years ago. Back then, everything seemed so bright and full of promise. We were heading toward a new life, filled with hope. Now we were leaving empty-handed, abandoning everything we had fought for. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Maria suddenly asked. Her question caught me off guard. I looked at her and saw fear in her eyes. She had always been strong, but now I could see how much this was weighing on her. "We don't have a choice," I replied. "We have to think about Sophia." She nodded, but I knew my answer didn't comfort her. It didn't comfort me either. A few hours into the drive, the car started to stall. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to figure out what was wrong. The engine had overheated. I got out, opened the hood, and saw steam pouring out of the radiator. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath. Maria got out and walked over to me. "What's wrong?" she asked. "The engine's overheated. We'll have to wait for it to cool down." We stood by the roadside, illuminated only by the headlights. Around us was nothing but desert and the night sky. Sophia woke up and asked why we had stopped. Maria calmed her, saying everything was fine, but I saw the worry in her pale face. Half an hour later, a truck drove by and stopped a short distance ahead. A man in a cowboy hat climbed out of the cab. "Need some help?" he asked as he walked toward us. I looked at him warily. In moments like this, it was hard to trust anyone. "Radiator," I said curtly. He nodded and said he had some water in his truck. He helped us pour it into the radiator, and a few minutes later we were back on the road. I didn't know who he was, but that night I was grateful to him. As we got closer to the border, I felt a growing sense of anxiety. What if we were stopped? What if our documents raised suspicion? I tried not to think about it, but every time I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Sophia, my heart ached. All I wanted was for her to be safe, even if it meant sacrificing everything. We drove in silence until the lights of the checkpoint appeared on the horizon. It was the moment I had dreaded most. The first lights of the checkpoint shimmered in the distance, like beacons warning of an approaching storm. We drove slowly, speaking barely a word. Every movement of the car, every sound, seemed louder than usual. Sophia had fallen asleep again, her head resting on Maria's lap. I tried to focus on the road, but my thoughts swirled relentlessly. Everything I knew about the border filled me with dread. Had I heard stories of people who managed to slip through? Of course. But I also knew dozens of tales about those who were caught, humiliated, and sent back in conditions worse than when they had arrived. I had to be strong, for Sophia, for Maria. The road to the border felt like a flashback to when I had first crossed it the other way. Back then, I was young and full of hope. We had trekked through the desert at night to avoid patrols. Thirst parched my throat and my legs ached with exhaustion, but I didn't stop. Maria was waiting for me, and Sophia hadn't been born yet but was already a part of my dreams. Back then, I thought I'd overcome the hardest part. How wrong I was. Now everything was different. Instead of a dark desert, there was a paved road. Instead of a group of strangers, there was my family. But the fear remained, only now it was stronger. I wasn't afraid for myself. I was afraid for them. As we neared the border, we were stopped by the first patrol. A car with flashing lights blocked the road, and a soldier in uniform signaled for us to pull over. I felt my chest tighten. Maria squeezed my shoulder, silently trying to pass me her strength. "Papers, please," the soldier said, leaning in through the window. His gaze was cold and professional, with no hint of empathy. I handed him the fake IDs we had bought years ago. He took them, studied me for a moment, then looked at Maria and finally at the sleeping Sophia. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Home, to Mexico," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded and then carefully inspected the car. His flashlight illuminated our boxes, bags, and Sophia's toys. I saw him linger on one box holding our photos. After what felt like an eternity, he returned the papers and said, "Go ahead." As we drove away, I exhaled so loudly that Maria turned to look at me. She was just as tense, but her eyes said, "We'll make it." Even though we weren't safe yet, her confidence gave me strength. A few kilometers down the road, we pulled over again. Despite the truck driver's help earlier, the car was still overheating. I decided to let the engine rest. The night was cool and the stars shone brighter than I had ever seen. Sophia woke up and stretched sleepily. "Are we in Mexico yet?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "Almost," Maria said, pulling her into a hug. I looked at them and realized that they were the reason I was willing to do anything, for their future, for their safety. Even if it meant starting over from scratch. We shared the last sandwich Maria had packed that morning and drank some water. I tried to appear calm, but my hands were still trembling. We had less than 20 kilometers to the border. So close, yet it felt impossibly far. When we got back on the road, the path grew narrower. Around us were only barren landscapes, occasionally lit by the moonlight. It felt like the world had stopped. Then, suddenly, we saw a group of people walking along the road, carrying large bags. Their faces looked tired, but their eyes glimmered with hope. They were just like us, people searching for a chance. One of them raised a hand, signaling for us to stop. I slowed the car, but Maria placed her hand on my shoulder. "Are you sure?" she asked. "They don't look dangerous," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure myself. We stopped. A man, probably in his 40s, approached the window. His face was worn, but he smiled as soon as he saw Sophia. "Are you heading to the border?" he asked. I nodded. "We are too. Can we join you? We have children, they're exhausted." Maria looked at me and I knew she felt the same as I did. We couldn't refuse. They were like us. We let them climb into the car, squeezing into the backseat. Sophia quietly played with another little girl as we continued down the road, the weight of responsibility for these people now added to my own. When we reached the border, the sight of military vehicles and police officers sent another wave of cold dread through me. The line of cars stretched for kilometers. People stood on the roadside, their belongings scattered everywhere. It looked like a scene from a war movie. I glanced at Maria and then at Sophia. Her eyes were filled with curiosity, but I saw how she clutched her toy dog tightly. I knew she felt the tension, even if she didn't understand what was happening. An officer approached our car and tapped on the window. I rolled it down and heard the question that felt like a verdict. "What's the purpose of your trip?" "Returning home," I answered, silently praying that this would be true. The line at the border moved slowly, as if time itself had slowed down. Cars stood in long rows, resembling an endless snake of metal and plastic. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the hum of engines and the occasional murmur of voices. My eyes scanned the soldiers, police officers, their weapons, and the dogs sniffing trunks and undercarriages. It felt like every patrol officer was ready to see a threat in us. Sophia sat quietly in the back seat, clutching her toy dog. Her usually cheerful face was tense, her eyes fixed on the window. I knew what she was feeling even if she couldn't put it into words. It was the same feeling tearing me apart: fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. Maria sat silently beside me, but I could see her hands trembling as she fidgeted with the documents. Her face was pale, and she avoided looking at me, afraid that her eyes might reveal more than her words. When it was finally our turn, I took a deep breath, exhaling slowly to calm myself. A stern-faced officer approached our car, gesturing for me to roll down the window. His eyes swept over us briefly before he demanded our documents. "Purpose of your trip?" he asked. "We're returning home to Mexico," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. The officer studied our IDs for what felt like an eternity, then called over a colleague. The second officer approached with a dog which began sniffing around the car. My heart froze when the dog stopped at the trunk and started barking. The officer nodded to his partner, who opened the trunk. They began searching through our belongings, boxes, bags, Sophia's toys. It felt as though they were looking for something specific. "What are you transporting?" the first officer asked me. "Just our belongings," I replied. "We have nothing to hide." He grunted, continuing to inspect the car. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Maria gripped my shoulder and I could feel her hand shaking. Among our things, the officer found an old box of photographs. He opened it and started flipping through the pictures. One was from our wedding, another of Sophia's first birthday. His expression remained unreadable until he paused at a photo of me holding Sophia as a newborn. He glanced at me, then at Maria and back at the photo. "You have a daughter?" he asked. "Yes, that's her," I said, nodding toward the back seat. The officer looked at Sophia. Her wide eyes stared at him, a mixture of curiosity and fear. He closed the box and handed it back to me. "Make sure you have all your belongings. You may go," he said, though his voice carried a hint of hesitation. I couldn't believe my ears. We got back into the car and I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. But it wasn't over yet. As we drove the final stretch toward the Mexican side, chaos erupted ahead of us. A car in front suddenly stopped and people poured out of it. They were shouting and gesturing wildly as officers tried to restrain them. I froze, unsure of what to do. Cars behind us began honking, but no one moved. Maria grabbed my hand. "What's happening?" she whispered. "I don't know," I replied, staring at the scene ahead. One of the officers fired a shot into the air, trying to calm the crowd. The people froze, but the tension remained palpable. We waited for the situation to resolve, but it felt like an eternity. I felt Sophia press against my back and heard her soft voice. "Papa, I'm scared." "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound confident. Finally, the line began to move again. We slowly approached the Mexican side of the border. The atmosphere there was completely different. People looked exhausted, but their eyes held a glimmer of hope. Our inspection was quick, with no unnecessary questions. When we crossed the border, I felt something shift inside me. This was the end of one journey and the beginning of another. We had returned home, but it no longer felt like the home I remembered. Maria felt it too. We both knew there would be many challenges ahead, but the most important thing was that we were together. Sophia looked out the window and asked, "Are we home?" "Yes, sweetheart," Maria said, pulling her into a hug. "We're home." We crossed the border, but the sense of relief didn't come. On the Mexican side, we were greeted by a dusty open lot crowded with people and cars. There were no stern officers or trained dogs, only volunteers and locals handing out water and food. Sophia's eyes lit up when one of the men handed her a chocolate bar, a small joy on such a heavy day. We found a spot at the edge of the lot and sat down on the ground next to our belongings. Maria was silent, staring off into the distance. I tried to guess what she was thinking, but her face gave nothing away. Sophia, it seemed, was the only one untouched by the weight of the moment. She played with other children as if nothing had changed. My head was full of questions. What now? How would we live? Where would we find work? These thoughts came in an endless stream, amplifying my exhaustion. I looked at Maria, at Sophia, and felt a wave of guilt rising inside me. I was the one who brought them here. I was the one who chose to go to America, and now I was the one bringing them back. "It's not your fault," Maria said suddenly, as if reading my thoughts. I looked at her, surprised by her words. "I can see you blaming yourself," she continued. "But we did what we had to do, for Sophia, for us." Her voice was firm, but her eyes betrayed the pain she was feeling. She was struggling too, but she stayed strong for me and Sophia. A few hours later, we made it to the nearest bus station. It was as crowded as the border, but the atmosphere was lighter. People were discussing their plans, talking about where they were heading and what they would do. Some shared stories about loved ones waiting for them in other towns. We bought tickets for a bus to our hometown. The money we had saved was barely enough, but it would get us back to the place where our life had begun. I didn't know what lay ahead, but deep down I felt this was a new chance. The bus was old and rattled with every bump in the road, but for us, it was a step forward. Maria held Sophia in her arms and I sat by the window watching the changing landscapes. Fields, mountains, small villages, they all seemed both familiar and foreign. I thought about how much I had changed over the years. When I left, I was full of hope. Now, I was coming back with experiences and scars, not just on my body but on my soul. Sophia quietly fell asleep, her face peaceful. Maria dozed off too, her head resting on my shoulder. I felt their warmth and knew that this was worth living for. For them, I was ready to start over. When the bus stopped at the small station in our town, I felt a mix of emotions. The place was painfully familiar. Narrow streets, small houses with peeling paint, the market where I had first met Maria, it all seemed unchanged, as if time had stood still. But I knew we were no longer the same people who had left here so many years ago. We stepped off the bus, gathered our belongings and headed to my mother's house. She was the only one who could take us in. When I knocked on the door, it felt like an eternity before it opened. Her face lit up as soon as she saw us. She hugged Maria, then Sophia, and finally me. It was a moment I would remember forever. "I knew you'd come back," she said, wiping away tears. We stepped inside and I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift. Here we were safe. Here we were home. Weeks passed after our return. We started to settle in, finding our footing again. It wasn't easy, but I saw how Maria supported me. She found part-time work at the market while I got a job at a construction site. Sophia started attending the local school and quickly made new friends. Her smile was the best reminder of why we had endured everything we did. One evening, sitting in the yard, I looked up at the stars and thought about the future. I knew we had a long road ahead. But I also knew we would make it. We had already proven that by surviving everything life had thrown at us. Maria came outside carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. She sat down beside me and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "That we're going to be okay," I replied. She took my hand and I felt the warmth of her touch spread through me. In that moment, I knew that despite all the challenges, we were on the right path. Our life in America had ended, but it wasn't the end of our dream. We had returned to where we began, but we were stronger now. We were a family that had been through everything and stayed together. And I knew that for them I would keep moving forward no matter what. America had taught us a lesson, and Mexico had given us a chance to start anew. And we were determined to make the most of it.